Welcome, dear listeners, to Broken Promises. Tonight's story is called The CEO in the Kitchen. One day, her mother-in-law's distinguished guest accidentally passed by the kitchen. The moment he saw her, he dropped to his knees. It was a sweltering late August morning in Scarsdale, New York. The heat pressed down on the roof of the sprawling mansion like a heavy lid. A lazy wind did little more than stir the hot dust. In this affluent suburb, every house gleamed, their wrought iron gates painted a glossy black, their stone driveways cool to the touch. But beyond the pristine facades was a different kind of cold, the chill of how people treated one another. My name is Anna Harrison. To outsiders, I was the lucky daughter-in-law who had married a high-powered executive, living in a mansion and driving a luxury car. But a big house isn't always a warm home. Some houses, no matter how large, only have room for one person's ego. That morning, I was in the kitchen of our mansion. Honestly, it wasn't much different from any other kitchen. The same smell of onions and garlic, the same sound of a knife on a cutting board, the same feeling of a woman quietly preparing a meal. The only difference was that everything was sleeker, gleaming black granite countertops, a bright induction stove, and pots and pans arranged in a perfect, display-like row. I was wearing a beige apron, stir-frying the last of the green beans for lunch, when I heard the soft shuffle of my mother-in-law's slippers in the living room. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, sat enthroned on the plush sofa, her back ramrod straight. A heavy gold bracelet adorned her wrist, and she wielded the television remote like a scepter. The moment I stepped out of the kitchen, her eyes scanned me from head to toe. It was a look that, without a single word, made you feel utterly out of place. She jutted her chin out, her voice sharp but clear. "Anna, Rick's distinguished guest will be here soon. You, standing there, with your apron reeking of onions and garlic, are an eyesore. Get back in the kitchen." I froze for a beat, then lowered my head. "Yes, ma'am." My yes was so quiet it felt like I was swallowing it down. They say you should pick your battles, but too much forbearance becomes a habit, and a habit becomes an invitation for disrespect. At exactly 10:30 a.m., my husband, Rick, came downstairs. He wore a crisp white shirt, gray slacks, his hair slicked back with gel, a watch glinting on his wrist. He looked every bit the successful entrepreneur you see online, lacking only a kind smile for his wife. Rick glanced at me, his lips twitching as if he'd just tasted dust. "Go to the kitchen, slice some fruit, and make some tea. Then make yourself scarce. I'm closing a multi-million-dollar deal today. Having a woman in the living room, chattering away will ruin everything." The word woman struck me like a spoon hitting the side of a pot, a sharp, hollow clang. So that's what I was in this house, a woman, someone only allowed to be present for service, but who had to disappear when appearances mattered. Sitting beside him, Eleanor nodded in approval like a teacher grading an essay. "There, listen to your husband. A woman's place is in the kitchen. Don't be out here making a nuisance of yourself." I turned back to the kitchen. It had glass doors looking out onto the back patio, where the sun glared down, the heat a physical weight on my shoulders. I opened the refrigerator and took out the fruit, apples, grapes, the best of everything, because this family valued appearances above all. I sliced the apples thinly, arranging them in a perfect circle. My hands were busy, but my mind felt stretched taut, as if by invisible threads. Distinguished guest was just a fancy term. The guest was coming here so Rick could show off to his mother, to boast that the contract was in his grasp, giving Eleanor a reason to preen in front of the neighbors. The actual signing would happen at the corporate headquarters, in a conference room with secretaries, legal counsel, and official minutes. But for this mother and son, what mattered wasn't the paperwork, it was the perception of the world. I heated the kettle, taking out the finest tea from the cabinet. Rick often bragged that it was a special gift from a business partner, warning me not to touch it as if it were a sacred artifact. I always remained silent. Sometimes, explaining things is like casting pearls before swine. People believe what they want to believe. I set the tea tray on the counter, poured the water, and watched the temperature. Good tea requires precision. Water too hot, and it becomes bitter, too cool, and it's weak. I chuckled to myself. My life was like that teapot. People kept pouring boiling water in and then complaining about the taste. From the living room, Eleanor's voice carried, deliberately loud so I could hear. What's taking so long to brew a pot of tea? Other men's wives know how to talk, how to entertain guests. Ours. I suppose her lot in life is just the kitchen. I squeezed the handle of the knife, then released it. I wouldn't allow myself to get angry. Anger was a loss. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that sometimes silence isn't submission, it's conserving your strength. Just then, the doorbell chimed, a clear, crisp sound that shifted the entire house's atmosphere. Eleanor shot up as if spring-loaded, her face breaking into a radiant smile. Oh, that must be Mr. Thorne. Rick adjusted his collar, straightened his tie, and strode to the door as if welcoming a stroke of great fortune. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the sound of his dress shoes clicking on the marble floor, a steady, cold rhythm that sent a shiver down my spine. I carried the fruit tray to the kitchen doorway and witnessed a moment that was both comical and painful. Eleanor was smiling so broadly that the corners of her eyes crinkled, her voice as sweet as a child's. Mr. Thorne, please, come in. Welcome, welcome. Then she caught sight of me. Her eyes instantly turned to ice. Right in front of the guest, she announced, "Oh, please excuse the mess, the help is just finishing up." I stood frozen, feeling as if someone had just thrown a bucket of ice water on my chest. The help. In my own home, I had become the help, simply because I was wearing an apron. Rick laughed along, his tone playful but not entirely a joke. That's my wife, Marcus. A bit of a homebody, only comfortable in the kitchen. Let's get our business done quickly, we have the official signing at the headquarters at 11:30. Mr. Thorne, a middle-aged man with a poised and distinguished air, offered only a polite smile. But I saw something flicker in his eyes, a brief pause, like someone noticing a hairline crack in a newly painted wall. I said nothing. I turned back into the kitchen, set the tray down, and untied my apron. Not quickly, not forcefully. I folded it neatly and hung it over the back of a chair, as if hanging up the role they had just forced me into. I washed my hands slowly, the water running through my fingers, but a fire burned within me. I wasn't washing away dirt, I was washing away the feeling of being misnamed, washing away the shame they had tried to brand on my forehead. Done, I returned to the teapot, pouring a small amount into a cup to taste. The aroma was delicate and deep. I told myself that a woman's life is sometimes about waiting for the water to boil, not to make tea for others, but so that when it's finally poured, everyone has to taste its true flavor. I carried the tea tray out to the hallway. My steps were light, my back straight. The noise of the living room was ahead, Eleanor's laughter, Rick's booming voice. And I, walking through this gleaming house, felt like I was in the middle of a play. And I knew that the more vigorously a play is acted, the more painful the curtain call. I placed the tea tray on the glass coffee table, so gently it made no sound. The room smelled of air conditioning and floor polish, a sterile kind of clean that couldn't mask the unpleasant odor of pretense. Rick was seated opposite Mr. Thorne, leaning back slightly, his arms spread wide as if giving a presentation. Eleanor sat to one side, the very picture of a CEO's mother, her eyes darting around to see if their guest was admiring the chandelier or the expensive ceramic vase she had just been boasting about. I bowed my head respectfully. "Sir, please have some tea." Rick didn't look at me, just nodded curtly, a signal that I was dismissed. Eleanor offered a thin smile, plastered on her face, and interjected, as if casually, "She's quite clumsy, you know. Only good for these little chores." I didn't respond. In this house, if I argued, I would immediately be labeled disrespectful and ill-mannered. So I retreated toward the kitchen doorway, standing just behind the wooden partition close enough to hear and see, and for them to assume I wasn't there. Rick began to pour out words like water. "My team is optimizing the shipping routes with a new system, using AI to manage truck flow and reduce warehouse wait times. This quarter, we're pushing the profit margin up to around 15%. Mr. Thorne sipped his tea. He didn't praise or criticize it, just gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. But I could read that calm. It wasn't trust, it was assessment. Eleanor chimed in, her voice full of pride. "You see, Mr. Thorne? My Rick is brilliant. When he gets promoted again, well, our family will be even better off. A woman like her, she gestured vaguely toward me, is only good for having children and cooking. Rick smirked, as if his mother's words had fanned his flames. Business requires vision. What does someone who spends all day in the kitchen know? Hearing that, a familiar pang went through me. There's a saying, use wisdom to deal with outsiders. Why, then, did my own family use words like knives? But I remained still. I reminded myself that words are free, yet some people use them to buy a sense of superiority. Mr. Thorne set his teacup down on its saucer. The click was tiny, but it was enough to make Rick pause mid-sentence. Mr. Thorne asked, his voice calm but sharp. That 15% profit margin, is that based on reducing spoilage or increasing service fees? Rick answered quickly, like a student reciting a memorized lesson. Both, sir. We've optimized our cold chain supply, reducing spoilage, and we have a VIP service package for our strategic clients. Mr. Thorne looked him straight in the eye and pressed. Which standard does your cold chain use? HACCP, ISO 22000? Or do you just set internal KPIs? Rick faltered. I could see it in the way his fingers tightened slightly on his glass. Then he laughed it off. Oh, we're flexible on that. The operations department handles the details. I'm in sales. I close the deals. Mr. Thorne said nothing more, just an awe. But it was the kind of awe you make when you tap on a table to see if the wood is solid or hollow. Eleanor, however, didn't notice. She was too busy pouring more tea and boasting. Don't you worry, Mr. Thorne. Our family does everything by the book. My Rick is meticulous. Then she turned her head toward the kitchen, her voice rising intentionally. Anna, brew another pot. A woman shouldn't be so slow. We're doing big business here. No one has time to wait. I didn't move immediately. I refused to run at her command like it was a conditioned reflex. I refilled the kettle, rinsed the cups, following the proper procedure slowly but surely. Because I understood that a true tea connoisseur doesn't need noise, while someone who just wants to give orders loves to shout. When I brought out the new pot of tea, Rick was talking about their ERP system, project cash flow, and disbursement funds, all very impressive sounding terms. But Mr. Thorne still didn't look convinced. He would occasionally raise an eyebrow, looking at Rick with the gaze of a man who has seen his fair share of people who talk a better game than they play. I placed the teapot down and poured for Mr. Thorne first, as etiquette dictated. He gave a slight nod of thanks. Just a nod, but it was worlds apart from how Rick and Eleanor looked at me. In that moment, I realized some people will treat you with decency without knowing who you are, while others can live beside you every day and only want to see you brought low. Eleanor saw Mr. Thorne nod at me, and it was as if her pride had been pricked. She cleared her throat and laughed falsely. Please forgive her, sir. She rarely goes out, so she doesn't know much about manners. Mr. Thorne placed his hand on the teacup, his voice still gentle. I think she pours tea very well, very steady. The comment wasn't meant as a defense, just a simple observation. But to Eleanor, it was like a tiny thorn. She gave a forced smile and quickly changed the subject, asking Rick how much his bonus would be this month. Rick, encouraged, started boasting again. Once this contract is signed, the sales team gets a huge bonus. Get ready, Mom. I'm getting a new car at the end of the year. I stood by the kitchen door, finding it all absurd. A new car, when the man hadn't even signed anything. But Rick spoke as if the signature was already in his pocket. Mr. Thorne was silent for a moment, then stood up. Excuse me, may I use the restroom? Eleanor immediately pointed the way, as if afraid he might get lost. Of course, of course. It's down this hall, to the right. Mr. Thorne walked down the back hallway, which passed by the kitchen. Rick leaned back into the sofa, exhaling with satisfaction, as if he had just verbally conquered his opponent. Eleanor turned to me, her voice low but still sharp. Stay in the kitchen. Don't show your face. We can't have people thinking this family doesn't know how to train a wife. I nodded. But this time, my nod wasn't one of submission. It was the nod of someone who had decided that some of the rules in this house were about to be rewritten. I turned back into the kitchen, listening to the sound of Mr. Thorne's footsteps on the cold marble, drawing closer. Each step was like the slow, steady tick of a clock. And I knew that sometimes, a single moment is all it takes for a discerning person to see the truth that an entire house is trying to hide. I had just turned to place the kettle back on the stove when I heard the footsteps stop at the end of the hallway. Not an abrupt stop, but a hesitant one, as if the person was debating whether to continue. This house was large, but that morning, the silence was so narrow that I could feel the breath of the person nearby. I didn't look up immediately. I acted busy, drying my hands, adjusting the tea tray, closing the lid on the sugar bowl. It was a habit of mine. The more stressed I felt, the more I needed to keep things orderly. People say a clean house is a cool house. I think a clear mind is what keeps you standing firm. The footsteps approached again, one step, then another. I saw a reflection in the glass of a kitchen cabinet and knew it was Mr. Thorne. He was passing the open kitchen doorway. At that exact moment, I casually reached for a black-bound notebook on a nearby shelf. I always kept it within reach, a habit from years of note-taking. Not for recipes, but for key deadlines, details that could not be wrong. I opened the notebook and jotted down a few short lines at a time, a name, a task to be completed. The pen scratched softly against the paper. I could feel Mr. Thorne's gaze on me, not prying, but like someone who had just noticed something that didn't fit. His gaze lingered for a second, then he moved on, maintaining his politeness. But I knew that 1 second was enough for a seasoned businessman to plant a flag in his mind, asterisk. Something is not right here. Asterisk, I didn't follow his gaze. I closed the notebook and set it down next to my phone, which was face down. The screen was dark, but I knew that with a single touch, everything behind the facade of the kitchen-bound daughter-in-law would spring into motion. I heard the restroom door close at the end of the hall, followed by the sound of a flush. While waiting for Mr. Thorne to return to the living room, I took a moment to do one small thing. I adjusted the vase of flowers on the kitchen counter. White gladioli. Eleanor liked them because they looked elegant. I wasn't fond of gladioli, but in a house where people only believed what they could see, sometimes you had to let them get drunk on the scent of elegance. Mr. Thorne returned, his shoes clicking on the marble floor again, but the rhythm seemed slower this time. As he passed the kitchen, he didn't stop, but his glance was quick and sharp. And I stood tall, not hunched over, or timid. I had nothing to prove. I just had to not diminish myself. Mr. Thorne re-entered the living room. I heard Rick's slightly too loud laugh, the kind of laugh a man has when he's overconfident. Eleanor was pouring more tea, along with more praise for her son. But after returning from the restroom, Mr. Thorne wasn't smiling politely anymore. He sat down, looked at the teacup before him without picking it up, and asked a question that was like a needle piercing a balloon. Rick, this contract involves cold storage and the transport route between the Bronx and the Port of Newark, correct? I'd like to see the spoilage control plan for each transfer point. Rick's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. Of course. We have a system for that. Spoilage is very low. Mr. Thorne nodded, his voice level. Which system? Who is responsible for signing off on the checks? And the data you've presented, which Apex Logistics report is it from? Rick was momentarily stumped. I could hear the hesitation in the small cough he gave before answering. It's from an internal report. I'll have the operations team send it over. Mr. Thorne gave a soft then continued, neither fast nor slow. An internal report is fine, but the official signing is at 11:30. I'll need a summary memo certified by your internal audit or legal department, just for my peace of mind. The atmosphere in the living room grew heavy. Eleanor probably didn't know what internal audit meant, but she heard legal department and her brow furrowed slightly, as if sensing this was no longer just about bragging rights. Rick rushed to smooth things over with a laugh. Marcus, you're so thorough. In business, trust is the main thing. Mr. Thorne looked him in the eye. Trust is good. But I've been in business a long time. I trust process more. As they say, better safe than sorry. The words shut Rick down. Eleanor quickly jumped in, her voice sweet, trying to lighten the mood. Oh, Mr. Thorne, rest assured, our family does everything properly. Rick is the pillar of this family, he takes care of everything. Mr. Thorne smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He glanced at his teacup and said something that sounded light but was full of meaning. A pillar is valuable, but if the foundation is hollow, it can collapse in the first winter storm. Eleanor froze, unsure how to interpret that. Rick tried to laugh, to pretend it was just a joke. I stood in the kitchen, rinsing a few cups, but my ears missed nothing. I didn't want Rick to be exposed right here in his own home. Not out of pity, but because I wanted things to unfold at the right pace. I knew men like Rick feared losing face. If he lost face too early, he would thrash about, creating chaos and looking for someone to blame. But if you let him slide at the right time and place, the fall would be one from which there was no recovery. Eleanor called out toward the kitchen again, as if to reassert her control. Anna, go pour the guest more tea. This time, I didn't answer with a yes. I simply walked out, poured the tea, placed the cup before Mr. Thorne, and stepped back. As my hand set the cup down, Mr. Thorne glanced up. His eyes met mine, not for long, but long enough. I saw the clarity in them, not the curiosity of a man looking at a woman, but the look of a businessman sizing up an unknown variable. Mr. Thorne said quietly, very politely. The tea is excellent. Thank you, ma'am. I just nodded. You're welcome. Hearing the word ma'am, Eleanor wanted to correct the script immediately. She forced a laugh. Oh, Mr. Thorne, don't praise her. She's got nimble fingers, but her head, well, she's just a woman. Mr. Thorne didn't argue, but he set his teacup down and asked Rick a final question that seemed to seal his suspicion. Rick, I have to ask directly. Who is the final decision maker for Apex Logistics on this deal? I need to know, I'm dealing with the person in charge. Rick laughed loudly, as if to drown out his nervousness. That would be me, of course. I'm the director of sales. I close all the deals. Mr. Thorne nodded, his face placid. Then please show me an email confirmation of your final authority or a letter of authorization. I don't want to get to the signing and be told we have to wait for your boss. In the kitchen, I turned the faucet down until the water dripped, each drop audible. I didn't need to see Rick's face to know if it was red or pale. Because people who are used to lying fear one thing most, a person who asks the one right question. There's a saying, you can't wrap a fire in paper. The fire was already lit, it just hadn't burst into flames yet. I stood there, my hands dry, my apron clean, my heart strangely calm. Not because I was heartless, but because I had learned to keep my emotions from pulling me off course. Out there, Rick was trying to laugh it off, Eleanor was trying to talk over it, and Mr. Thorne was silent, watching. And in that silence, I knew the play being performed in this house was starting to show cracks, like thin ice under the late summer sun. It wouldn't be loud, but it would surely break. I'm not one to air my grievances, but some things, if left unsaid, can be mistaken for weakness. The truth is, I was silent because I was planning my next move. 6 months ago, Apex Logistics entered a critical phase. In the business world, it's a time when a single crack can bring down a whole wall. We were preparing for our semi-annual audit, renegotiating our credit line with the bank, and had a major bid for a cold storage facility pending approval. These things sound dry as dust, but they are matters of survival. If an internal scandal erupted at that moment, shareholders would panic, partners would withdraw, the bank would tighten its grip, and the perpetrators could erase their tracks overnight. I had smelled something wrong for a while, not through a woman's intuition, but through data. Some numbers look good on the surface, but when you touch them, they feel fake. Inventory levels were unnaturally smooth, operating costs were suspiciously low, and profit reports were suddenly as perfect as a painting. I looked at the reports and saw a hastily made suit. The stitches were straight, but the cheap fabric would fall apart at the first drop of rain. I called Vincent, the head of internal audit, and David, the head of the legal department. I didn't make a scene, didn't slam my fist on the table or shout in the conference room. I just said one thing: I want a special, discreet review, by the book. All evidence must be legally sound. Vincent understood immediately. David looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. If you've decided, my team will also prepare a partner protection contingency plan. From that day on, I began to disappear in the way a person in power does. I didn't post about my busy schedule online. I didn't show up at parties where people take photos for their social media feeds. I locked down internal communications, delegated day-to-day approvals to my subordinates according to company policy, and let Rick handle the external-facing business development he so desperately craved. Don't misunderstand me, I wasn't giving up my seat out of emotion. I was placing Rick right where a trap should be. Power-hungry people will walk right into it, believing their time has come. Rick was a smooth talker and a good actor. He stepped out into the world as a real boss and gradually started to believe in his own performance. Meanwhile, I would return to that house every day, listen to Eleanor's complaints about dinner, and watch Rick come home late, reeking of expensive cologne. But at night, when the whole house was asleep, I did my real work. I didn't need to dress up as a security guard or run around like in the movies. I joined the special task force under the guise of a senior risk assessment consultant, with data access granted by the CEO's authority. I spent nights in the server room, cross-referencing system logs, reviewing the edit history of financial reports, and tracing cash flows. Everything leaves a trail, you just have to be patient enough to gather it and put it in the right order so that when it's revealed, it's irrefutable. Someone might ask, why didn't you catch Rick the moment you found out? I would just smile. Catching him early would have been easy, but catching him the right way was hard. If I had exposed him without enough evidence, he would have cried foul, accused me of slander, rallied his allies, and blamed his subordinates. Worse, the real rot in the system would have had time to cover its tracks and disappear. I didn't want to bring Apex down, just because I was impatient. I needed one clean cut, but a legal one, with minutes, logs, cash flow records, and the signature of the legal department. Haste makes waste. But there was another part, more painful than the company, the family. I once thought my in-laws might not love me, but at least they would be civil. But when they became convinced I was just a dependent daughter-in-law, their true colors showed. Eleanor started lecturing me with phrases that were as worn as old knives. A daughter-in-law must know her place, be patient, and serve her husband's family to maintain good fortune. Rick would say things that sent a chill down my spine. Just stay home and be quiet. Leave the big things to me. The big things, yet the household money he gave me was like a handout. If it wasn't enough, he'd sneer, "What are you spending so much on?" I'm not saying this for pity. I'm just saying that when people see you as beneath them, they will treat you exactly as they imagine you to be. And at that point, you have two choices. 1. Lash out with angry words and be branded a shrew. Or 2. Quietly build your case and wait for the right moment for them to swallow their own words. I chose the second path. When I was little, my mother used to sing me a nursery rhyme about a girl being like a piece of silk, unsure of whose hands she would fall into. Back then, I was afraid of those hands. Now, it's different. I am no longer a piece of silk for someone to pick up and put down. I weave my own frame, and anyone who wants to tear it will pay the price. On the morning of August 22nd, as I stood in the kitchen listening to Rick boast and Eleanor call me the help, I wasn't surprised. I had seen their true nature long ago. The only thing I was waiting for was for them to say more, do more, and seal their own fate. I poured the tea, set down the cup, and retreated into the kitchen. Not out of fear, but because when a man is standing on a fake pedestal, you don't need to pull him down. You just need to remove the right pin. The pedestal will collapse on its own. Some truths don't need to be exposed. The wrongdoers will reveal themselves with their own mouths. My suspicions about Rick didn't start on August 22nd, but a few weeks earlier. One evening, I was folding our son's clothes when I heard the click of his home office door. Rick walked in, phone in hand, his voice low but sharp. "I already told you, just push those expenses into the operational budget. The profit margin has to look good. If it looks good, we get the deal." And if we get the deal, everyone gets a piece. I froze. Everyone gets a piece sounds like sharing a prize, but in business, it often comes with something much dirtier, a kickback. I didn't storm in and demand an explanation, nor did I resort to planting a listening device like in the movies. This house had too many eyes and ears. Any unusual move and Eleanor would invent a story about a snooping wife. I simply did one thing. I noted the time in my notebook and the name of the company Rick mentioned later in the call. It was an unfamiliar name, not on Apex's list of regular contractors. Rick spoke its name with a familiarity usually reserved for family. A few days later, Rick mentioned it again, this time more clearly. Just leave Sterling Ventures to me. Sterling Ventures? The name sent a chill through me. I began to investigate through legal channels, using my own authority. No one needed to know. I just cross-referenced. Sterling Ventures appeared, as perfect as a painting. It was newly established, had a clean profile, and a steady stream of contracts and payments. Everything was so steady it was absurd. As they say, too perfect is often fake. I looked at the payment chain and wanted to laugh. It was structured like a textbook example for an accounting student. But life isn't a textbook. That night, Rick came home late, smelling faintly of alcohol. He tossed his keys on the table, threw his jacket over a chair, and pulled a thick wad of cash from his wallet. He peeled off a few bills and slapped them on the table in front of me. Here. This month's household money. Don't ask so many questions. His tone wasn't of giving money, but of tossing a bone. I looked at the cash without counting it. I just looked up. With this amount, what about our son's tuition next month and my mother's regular checkup? Rick waved his hand dismissively. Why are you worrying about the big picture? You're at home, just do your job. If you're short, I'll figure it out. Eleanor, sitting nearby, heard the word short and immediately chimed in, her voice as casual as if discussing the weather. Women. They see money, and they worry. This family has Rick to carry the load. All she needs to do is make sure the meals are decent. I didn't argue. I went to the kitchen to wash the dishes, but my heart felt dry. I thought about the saying 1 moment of patience brings 9 moments of peace. And I wondered, peace for whom? Peace for this family to maintain its facade, or peace for me to keep a cool head? A few days later, Eleanor was chatting with a neighbor by the gate. In our upscale community, the gates were high and the walls thick, but gossip could still drift over if someone wanted it to. Eleanor leaned against the gate, her voice carrying. We have some good news coming. My Rick is handling a huge contract. I hear once it's signed, he's getting a big promotion. At that point, a daughter-in-law should know her place. You can't expect a dime store necklace to look right in a jewelry box. The neighbor just smiled, pretending not to understand. But I, standing in the yard, heard every word. I suddenly found it funny, the kind of funny that numbs you. So in Eleanor's eyes, I was like an object useful, keep it, tired of it, replace it. That evening, Rick was on another call. This time, thinking I was in the bathroom bathing our son, he spoke louder. I had taken our son out onto the balcony for some fresh air and happened to overhear snippets of his conversation dropping onto the stone floor below. You guys just get the signature. We'll handle the numbers. Bad debt? I'll park it somewhere else. Don't worry. Then, a sentence that made me grip the railing tightly. This quarter's profit has to be 15%. If it's not, don't even dream of a commission. Commission. So it was clear. Rick wasn't just trying to make things look good, he was falsifying them for a bonus. People say greed leads to ruin, but many greedy people think they're smart, that they're just being flexible. Only when the noose tightens around their neck do they realize flexibility has its limits. I noted the time. The very next day, I sent a message to Vincent through a secure internal channel, need to cross-reference our newest subcontractor, Sterling Ventures, and review all ERP data modifications related to profit margins in the recent period. I didn't write much. I wrote only what was necessary. In this kind of work, fewer words are sharper, and older data is more revealing. Some of the data manipulations occurred at the exact times Rick was at the office. Some payments went out and then returned through a strange loop, like money taking a vacation and coming home as if it never left. If you just told this as a story, it would sound like gossip. But when it's in a system log, on a bank statement, and in a formal report, it's no longer up for debate. At home, Rick continued to play the hero. He told Eleanor, as if making a solemn vow. "Mom, don't worry. After this deal is signed, I'll buy you whatever you want." Eleanor, overjoyed, turned to me, her voice condescending. "See? A woman's worth is in her good fortune. You just be obedient and enjoy it." I looked at her, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of pity. Pity for a mentality that measured a person's worth in dollars. They say cleverness is no match for fate. Perhaps Eleanor forgot that sometimes, fate is the law, it's evidence, it's a process that doesn't flatter anyone. That night, when the house was asleep, I opened my notebook. I didn't write about the kitchen. I wrote about my son, about his future. I didn't want him to grow up in a house where his mother was disrespected, where he was taught that money could buy respect. I also didn't want him to witness his mother screaming, pulling her hair, and clawing for justice. I wanted him to see his mother stand tall and win with integrity. I put down my pen and closed the book. Outside, the air conditioner hummed. Inside me, a different kind of quiet had settled. A quiet to wait for the right moment. A quiet to ensure that when everything came to light, no one could say I was being an emotional woman. And I knew that sooner or later, this house would have to hear the echo of its own words. Only this time, the atmosphere would be very different. No one would be laughing. In a house, the most intoxicating thing isn't wine, it's the feeling of being on top. Rick sat in the living room, speaking as if the entire deal was already wrapped up and sitting in his briefcase. Eleanor grew more smug by the minute, her eyes darting to the door as if waiting for a neighbor to pass by so she could drop a casual boast. I was no longer in the kitchen. I had moved to the shadows of the hallway, a spot where I could see the living room through the slats of the partition. From there, I could hear Rick's voice clearly without being accused of showing my face. It was ironic, in this house, they defined my place as if I were a broom. Rick raised his glass of water, his voice full of excitement. "Don't you worry, Marcus. My team is fast and efficient. We'll head to headquarters to sign, and I promise I won't keep you waiting." Mr. Thorne didn't raise his glass in a toast, he just touched it politely. Some people, the less they show, the harder they are to read. But I could see the alertness in his eyes, the kind of alertness of someone who had seen many deals made in the clouds come crashing down to earth. Eleanor chimed in again with her saccharine voice. "It's such an honor to have you in our home, Mr. Thorne. It's a blessing for our family. My Rick is so busy, but he insisted on hosting you personally because he values relationships." Mr. Thorne smiled. "Relationships are indeed valuable, ma'am. But in business, clarity is essential." The word clarity, spoken as gently as a breeze, made Rick flinch. He laughed it off, trying to steer the conversation. Of course, clarity. Everything I do is transparent." I heard the word transparent and smirked to myself. People who talk a lot about transparency are usually the ones who fear the light. Truly transparent people just show you the documents. Rick smoothed the sleeve of his shirt as he spoke, a familiar gesture he made whenever he wanted to appear in control. Eleanor looked at her son with the pride of someone admiring a statue. I wondered. If the statue was hollow, who would be the one to step aside when it fell? At 10:55 a.m., I knew the time not to be dramatic, but because I had already set the system trigger. A trigger that, if it didn't go off, would be a cause for concern. But if it did, it was just the process running its course. A ping sounded from Rick's phone. It was a soft notification, but in the quiet, air-conditioned room, it was as loud as a pin dropping. Rick glanced at his screen, a smile still on his face. The smile froze for less than a second, then melted as if doused with cold water. He flipped his phone face down on the table so quickly it was almost clumsy, making a spoon on a nearby plate clatter. Eleanor startled. "What is it, dear?" Rick tried to keep his voice steady. "Nothing, Mom." Just a system glitch. Mr. Thorne looked directly at Rick. He didn't ask a question, but his silence made Rick even more flustered. The most unnerving thing is when the person across from you refuses to be led. Rick's phone buzzed again, then again, as if someone was using it as a drum. Rick covered the screen with his hand, his eyes darting around. I could see a sheen of sweat on his temple, despite the cold air conditioning. He forced another weak smile. My apologies, Marcus. I think our IT department is doing some maintenance. It will be fine once we get to the office. Mr. Thorne picked up his teacup, took a small sip, and set it down gently. He asked a single question, as if just making conversation. But it was really a confirmation. Maintenance? Just as we're about to sign? Rick was speechless for a half second before replying quickly. Just a coincidence, I'm sure. A coincidence? In life, too many coincidences start to look like a plan. The phone vibrated continuously. This time, Rick couldn't hide it. The screen glowed a bright red through the gaps in his fingers. I couldn't see the words, but I knew what they were. The words a man full of ambition hates most: access denied. Account suspended. Rick shot up from his chair, its legs scraping loudly against the marble floor. He grabbed his phone and stepped away, his voice low, but the panic was evident. Hello? Why is it locked? Who signed the order? No, I don't approve. I'm with a client. The phrase "I'm with a client" sounded more like a plea than a command. Just moments ago, he had been promising not to keep anyone waiting. Now, he himself was being forced to wait by something invisible. Eleanor turned to Mr. Thorne, forcing a smile to cover the awkwardness. You know how it is being a boss. The staff calls about every little thing. Mr. Thorne didn't play along. He glanced at Eleanor, then his eyes flickered to his own phone on the table. I saw him tap the screen on, a habit of a businessman smelling trouble. Mr. Thorne didn't speak, but his posture had changed. He was no longer a guest making a social call. He was a man preparing for a risk scenario. Rick walked back in, his face pale. He swallowed hard, his eyes blinking rapidly like someone sleep-deprived. But his pride was still intact. He tried to power through. Marcus, please excuse me for one moment. I have an urgent call from the office. I'll take care of it in 2 minutes and be right back. Mr. Thorne nodded politely. Take your time. Rick practically ran out the front door, as if escaping. Not escaping the guest, but escaping the feeling of his power slipping away right in front of everyone. Eleanor watched him go, her lips pressed into a thin line, a flicker of worry in her eyes that she tried to hide. With Rick gone, the living room suddenly became quieter. So quiet, I could hear the wall clock ticking, each second a cold, steady beat. Mr. Thorne turned to Eleanor, his voice still pleasant but sharp. Ma'am, for a contract this large, doesn't Apex Logistics usually have legal counsel present? Why is Rick hosting me at home today? Eleanor was flustered. She was used to men talking business while women listened. Asked a direct question, she was like a dancer whose music had just stopped. She fumbled. Oh, Rick is very proactive. He wanted to host you personally, as a sign of respect. Mr. Thorne said, again, but it was an of disbelief. I saw him glance toward the hallway where I stood hidden. He couldn't see me, but it was as if he was putting the pieces together, the fancy house, the boasting mother, the overconfident husband, and a system that had just delivered a warning shot. I didn't step out. I didn't smile smugly. I just breathed steadily, like a driver gripping the wheel as the car starts to skid. Because I knew this was just the beginning of the slide. The real pain would be what Rick would try to grab onto to keep from falling. And when people grab in a panic, they often pull the very things they were trying to hide out into the open. The sound of a car door slamming, carried from the driveway. Rick must be calling someone, looking for a life raft. Inside, Mr. Thorne sat calmly, like the surface of a deep lake. Eleanor began to fidget, twisting the lid of the teapot that she had been holding. I looked at the neatly folded apron on the kitchen chair and thought to myself, a clear conscience fears no accusation. The person who was most afraid right now wasn't me. The one who was afraid was running around outside. The moment Rick was out of sight, the living room felt like it had been vacuumed of all sound. Eleanor remained seated, but her posture had lost its arrogance. She twisted the teapot lid in her hand, so much so that I could see her red-painted nails trembling. Some people spend their whole lives accustomed to being on top. When they encounter something beyond their control, all they can do is cling to inanimate objects. Mr. Thorne did not get up. He sat straight, his hands resting on his knees. His gaze was unnervingly calm, the calm of a man who had seen so many crises that he no longer let emotion dictate his actions. I stood in the shadowed hallway, unwilling to reveal myself just yet. I knew that in the world of business, there are moments when a single piece of information can change the entire game. I was waiting for that exact moment. Mr. Thorne's phone buzzed once, a quiet sound, but it made Eleanor jump as if her name had been called. He pulled out his phone, glanced at the screen, and his brow furrowed ever so slightly. He didn't open the message right away. He read the subject line first, a habit of someone verifying a source. His eyes scanned a few words and then stopped. Eleanor tried to smile, her voice strained. Probably the office confirming the signing time, right? Such a busy day. Mr. Thorne remained polite. I've just received a priority email. The word priority silenced Eleanor. I saw her swallow hard, her throat bobbing. In life, people fear things with red stamps, bold letters, or the kind of notification no one dares to ignore. Mr. Thorne opened the email. I couldn't see the screen, but I saw his hand pause as he scrolled to the attachment. He tapped to download a PDF file and then read it quickly, like a man accustomed to reviewing contracts. When he finished, he didn't exclaim. He just let out a very small breath, the breath of a man who has just narrowly avoided a fall. Eleanor, growing impatient but still trying to maintain her dignity, asked, "Is something wrong? My Rick has been with Apex for a long time. It must just be a technical glitch." Mr. Thorne looked up. His eyes held no triumph, no contempt, only seriousness. He spoke slowly, enunciating each word as if reading an official announcement in a boardroom. Apex Logistics has just sent an urgent notification. They are temporarily suspending the signing to protect their partners. The reason cited is the discovery of signs of serious irregularities in the financial reporting and concealment of project risks. Eleanor froze as if turned to stone. Her face went pale, but she still tried to argue out of reflex. "Oh, that must be a misunderstanding. My son is an honest businessman." Mr. Thorne didn't argue. He just lowered his voice a fraction, but his words carried more weight. The document specifically names the individual under review, Director of Sales, Rick Harrison. The name Rick Harrison fell into the room, and it felt like the air conditioning had failed, replaced by a different kind of chill. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked down at the teapot lid as if seeking an escape. I saw her hand clench so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Then Mr. Thorne glanced back at the document, as if to confirm the most critical detail. He read the signature line aloud. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for both me and Eleanor to hear. Electronically signed, Anna Harrison, CEO. The teapot lid slipped from Eleanor's hand. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, clean crack, not as loud as a plate shattering, but piercing. The white porcelain fragments scattered like shards of a mirror. Eleanor stared at the broken pieces, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. She stammered, as if hearing the name of someone long dead. A coincidence? It must be a coincidence. My daughter-in-law's name is Anna Harrison, but she's just... She couldn't finish. The sentence itself was absurd. If it were just a coincidence, why would the name be in the CEO's position? If she were just a housewife who knew only the kitchen, how could she have the authority to electronically cancel a multi-million-dollar deal moments before it was signed? A person can lie to themselves once, twice, but to keep lying at this point is just desperation. Mr. Thorne didn't smile. He placed his phone on the table and looked around the living room. His gaze was no longer that of a guest, it was the look of a man assembling a puzzle. The lavish chandelier, the gleaming leather sofa, Rick's boasting, Eleanor calling her daughter-in-law the help, it all suddenly formed a bizarre picture, like a silk robe on a shivering body. Mr. Thorne stood up and adjusted his jacket. He looked directly at Eleanor and said, very deliberately, "Ma'am, I think you should call your son back inside immediately, and, if you don't mind, I must ask, where is Miss Anna Harrison?" Eleanor's head whipped toward the kitchen, a reflex, as if the question had pulled her out of her shock. She opened her mouth to shout, but the command got stuck in her throat. She no longer had the confidence to shout. She just gasped for air, her eyes darting toward the hallway where I was concealed. I still didn't move. Not because I wanted to prolong their fear, but because I needed everything to be clear. The partner had read the document, understood the reason, and confirmed who was in charge. With everything laid out on paper, I had no need for a verbal argument. From the driveway, Rick's voice drifted in, muffled by the glass, frantic and broken. I could make out a few key words: authority. Who signed? Why? Like a man grasping at air. Mr. Thorne turned his head toward the kitchen doorway. His expression was not one of pleading or probing. It was the look of a man who wanted to speak to the person with real authority, to have a civilized conversation. I reached out and touched the latch on the glass kitchen door. It was cool. I pressed it. Asterisk. Click. Asterisk. The sound was small, but in the breathless room, it was like the flick of a switch. I didn't look at the broken porcelain, I looked straight ahead. They say words are wind, but documents and signatures don't blow away. And when the signature appears, every mouth that once spoke with contempt naturally falls silent. I took one step out of the hallway. Not rushed, not angry. It was simply time for me to stop standing in the shadows. I emerged, and the first thing I felt wasn't their eyes, but the silence. A silence as thick as smoke, blanketing a room that was usually so full of noise. Eleanor was standing near the coffee table, her hand still hovering in the air as if remembering the feeling of dropping the teapot lid. On the floor, the white porcelain fragments lay scattered like broken pieces of her dignity. I wasn't wearing an apron. I was in a tailored black pantsuit, simple but elegant. My hair was tied back neatly, revealing a crisp white collar. I hadn't magically changed, I had prepared for this, hanging the suit in the small changing room off the kitchen, like a traveler preparing a raincoat before the storm. Mr. Thorne looked at me, his gaze landing exactly where it should. I met his eyes directly, not flinching, not looking down. What I carried was not an air of glamour, but one of clarity. I took another step, positioning myself in the center of the living room, a place where everyone would see me as an equal, not a shadow lurking behind a kitchen door. I spoke, my voice not loud, but firm. Mr. Thorne, I apologize for the abruptness. Apex Logistics had a problem that needed to be cleaned up. I am Anna Harrison. That one sentence seemed to deflate Eleanor completely. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The command to get back in the kitchen, which used to roll off her tongue so smoothly, was now lodged in her throat. Mr. Thorne straightened his posture, adjusted his sleeves, and stepped forward. He extended his hand. It was not a gesture of appeasement, but the formal handshake of a businessman acknowledging a decision-maker. I shook his hand. His palm was warm and firm. He said, his voice softer now, like a man relieved of a great burden, "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Miss Harrison. You just saved me from a landmine." I nodded slightly. Not because I needed praise, but because I needed my partner to understand, Apex Logistics does not hide risks. We do not pass the bomb to someone else. In a long-term partnership, sometimes that's all that matters. Eleanor stood as if rooted to the spot. A moment ago, she was calling me the help. Now, the man she was trying to impress was shaking my hand with respect. I glanced at her for a second, just 1 second. I didn't offer a single sarcastic word. I let the truth do its own work. Life has a way of balancing the books, and it's not always with words. I turned to the coffee table. I didn't touch the broken porcelain, just picked up a napkin and placed it neatly beside the tea box. Even in chaos, I maintained a habit, everything in its proper place. People call it being a perfectionist, but sometimes that very perfectionism saves you from a fall. The notice of suspension was sent to you to protect you, I continued, my voice even. At 11:30, if you agree, we can meet at headquarters. My team has prepared a new contract proposal with enhanced risk control and data transparency clauses. I don't want you to sign anything blindly. Mr. Thorne nodded. I appreciate your approach. Many companies would try to hide their mistakes. You dared to stop and clean house. Hearing the words clean house, Eleanor staggered a step. She looked like someone waking from a dream they didn't want to believe. She stammered, her voice breaking, Anna. Honey. I didn't respond to her as a daughter-in-law. I just looked at her and said gently, but with enough force for her to understand the world had shifted, Eleanor, we can discuss family matters later. Right now, I'm conducting business with a partner. I didn't use harsh words, but calling her Eleanor instead of ma'am or mother was a line drawn in the sand. In any culture, a change in address signals a change of heart. Eleanor's face flushed, but she didn't dare react, not with Mr. Thorne standing there. Just then, the sound of a car door, then the main door bursting open, echoed from the front of the house. I knew Rick was back the way a man returns when he's heard bad news but hasn't had time to plan his retreat. Before the door swung fully open, I want to say one small thing to you, our listeners. If you've been listening this far and feel a sense of righteous anger, please leave a like to support Twilight Reflections. And please, leave a comment. If you were in this situation, would you choose to endure for the sake of peace, or stand tall for the sake of dignity? And I urge you to listen to the end, because as the truth unravels, there will be some very unexpected turns that will make many people swallow their own words. The front door flew open. Rick stormed in, his face ashen, his tie crooked, his hair a mess as if he'd been caught in a storm. The moment he saw me standing in the middle of the living room, in a suit, facing Mr. Thorne, he stopped short as if someone had slammed on the brakes. A second later, Rick's reaction wasn't an apology, but aggression. What the hell are you doing? He snarled, his eyes bloodshot. Did you hack the system? Why are you sabotaging my deal? Are you insane? Mr. Thorne took a half step back, not interfering. He was smart enough to know that family matters were for the family to resolve. But he was also observant enough to stand as a witness to Rick's behavior. Rick turned to Mr. Thorne, trying to salvage his pride. Marcus, don't listen to this woman. She's been at home too long. She imagines things. Let me handle the company business. I looked at Rick, not with a flare of anger, but with a clear understanding. Even at this point, he still wanted to use words to bend the truth. My voice was even. Rick, you just called me this woman in front of our business partner. So, let's handle this with documents. I walked over to a side table and picked up a thin file I had prepared. I didn't pull it out to intimidate him, I placed it on the coffee table like a cornerstone. Rick stared at the file, his eyes blinking rapidly. Eleanor, standing behind her son, wanted to defend him but was afraid of what Mr. Thorne would hear. I didn't open the file right away. I placed my hand on the cover, looked Rick straight in the eye, and said, clearly and professionally, stay calm. If you've done nothing wrong, the paperwork will protect you. But if you have, the paperwork will put you in your proper place. The tension in the room was as tight as a guitar string. Rick clenched his fists, as if about to lunge for the file, but he didn't dare. Not with Mr. Thorne watching, and not with the fear of what was inside. I stood my ground, like someone who had already chosen how this play would end. Rick took a half step forward, his hand raising as if to snatch the file, then freezing. He looked at Mr. Thorne, at his mother, then at me. His gaze was frantic, like a man who has just discovered the floor beneath his feet is no longer solid. Are you trying to humiliate me in front of an outsider? Rick seethed. Who do you think you are, lecturing me? I'm your husband. I didn't answer immediately. I pulled a single chair from the side, sat down, my back straight. In this house, I had been forced to stand in the shadows. Now, I chose to sit in the center, where every word had to pass through me. I rested my fingertips on the file folder, my voice calm. Do you want to have this conversation based on our roles, or based on the truth? Rick's eyes widened. The truth is you're ruining my career. I nodded slightly, as if logging his statement for later. Then let's hear the truth. I opened the file. I didn't flip through the pages dramatically. I turned each one slowly, letting the black and white text speak for itself. The first page is the internal audit review summary, signed by Vincent, dated, with a case number. I didn't read the whole thing, just the executive summary, the part that mattered. During the period from the beginning of last month to the present, signs of establishing a shell subcontractor, issuing fraudulent invoices, and manipulating profit figures to conceal bad debt risks have been identified. Eleanor gasped. What? No, my son is an honest businessman. Rick snapped at her. Mom, be quiet. With that one sentence, Eleanor's matriarchal authority deflated like a punctured balloon. She tried to speak again, but catching Mr. Thorne's eye, she swallowed her words. I turned to the second page, a transaction ledger. I didn't read out the specific amounts. I just pointed to the anomalies, dates, times, source accounts, destination accounts, and the circular flow back to Rick. Payments to Sterling Ventures for cold storage support services were routed out and then returned through an intermediary account. The cash flow does not match the volume of services rendered and approved. Rick let out a hollow laugh. You're making this up. Where did you get this? I looked up at him. From the Apex Logistics system. The access logs bear your username, and the bank reconciliation statements were obtained by the legal department with a court order. Mr. Thorne's brow furrowed slightly. He didn't interrupt, but I saw his shoulders tense, like a man who just realized he had narrowly avoided signing a deal that could have dragged him into the mud. Rick changed tactics, his voice rising. Cash flow is the accounting department's job. I'm in sales. Don't pin this on me. I didn't argue. I turned to the next page, a transcript of an internal recording, complete with the timestamp, camera location from the third-floor hallway, and the archived file name. I read just one line, enough to make the point without being theatrical. I'm telling you, push the costs to another category. The profit has to be 15%. If we sign, everyone gets a commission. The color drained from Rick's face. He opened his mouth, but no coherent denial came out. Because the voice on the recording was his. Unmistakably. Eleanor started breathing heavily. She looked at me, her expression shifting from confusion to fear. She suddenly turned to Mr. Thorne, her smile contorted. Sir, it's just an internal matter, a misunderstanding. Men in business sometimes make small mistakes. Mr. Thorne placed his hand on the arm of his chair, his voice still polite but cold. Ma'am, a mistake is different from an intentional act. I need to know where I stand. The phrase where I stand was like a splash of cold water on Rick. He turned to me, his eyes red with a mixture of anger and fear. What do you want? Are you not happy until I've lost everything? I set the papers down, not forcefully. I spoke slowly, each word a clear, separate entity. I want Apex Logistics to be clean. I want our partners not to be deceived. And I want no one in this house to ever have the right to call me the help again. Rick flinched, as if suddenly remembering the words he had used this morning. He tried to deflect, resorting to a familiar accusation. You're being petty. You're destroying your husband's career over a few words. I looked at him, not with ridicule, but with a genuine question. If you had signed this deal today, would you have come home and thanked me? Or would you have told me to make myself scarce again? Rick was speechless. Not because the question was difficult, but because the answer was so obvious he didn't dare say it aloud in front of an outsider. I turned to the last page of evidence, a system log of his actions. The time he logged in, the reports he edited, the export commands he ran, and the digital timestamp. I didn't need to read it all. I just pointed to the last line, where his user ID, R. Harrison, was recorded. From this moment on, I said, you can no longer claim you didn't know. The system recorded everything. Rick stood frozen. Then, he suddenly snarled, like a cornered animal. You think you've won? You've destroyed this family. When I lose face, what will our son think of you? Hearing the word son, Eleanor saw an opening and jumped in. That's right. Think of your child. A woman's virtue is in her forbearance. I turned to Eleanor. This time, I didn't stay silent. I spoke softly, but in a way that returned her own logic to her. You taught me forbearance, but you taught your son to disrespect his wife. That kind of forbearance only encourages bad behavior. Eleanor was silenced, her eyes turning red with either anger or fear. Mr. Thorne took a half step back, maintaining a professional distance. He looked at me, his voice concise. Miss Harrison, I understand now. I propose that all further discussions take place at your headquarters, following proper procedure. I will not sign anything until your company has been cleaned up. I nodded. Yes. I respect that. Hearing the words not sign, Rick felt his last support crumble. He lunged toward the table, his voice dropping from a shout to a pleading whisper, laced with a threat. Anna. Calm down. Let's talk about this in private. Whatever you want, we can talk in our room. I watched him for a moment. For the first time that morning, I no longer saw the dapper executive who had descended the stairs. I saw a man terrified of losing everything. I closed the file, placing it neatly in front of me, like a period at the end of a long, convoluted sentence. I didn't stand up or move closer. I just said one very simple thing that landed with immense weight. If you want to talk, talk here, in front of our witness. I don't want you claiming later that I made it all up. Rick pressed his lips together, his shoulders slumping. In that slump, I knew he understood. Some days, you don't fall because someone pushes you. You fall because you've walked too far on a bridge built of lies. Rick stood silently for a moment, then the defiant look on his face shattered like paint peeling off a wall. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Mr. Thorne and then back to me, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. Anna, don't do this. Whatever I did wrong, I'll fix it. Please don't push me over the edge. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at Rick, my gaze steady, without hatred or pity. People often think women are weak because they are soft-hearted, but sometimes, being soft-hearted is just pushing yourself back into the mud. I had stood in the mud for too long. I wasn't going back. Rick took a step closer, his hand reaching out as if to take mine, to pull me into a private negotiation. I took a half step back, just half a step, but enough for his hand to grasp at empty air. He froze, and then, suddenly, he dropped to his knees. It wasn't a graceful, cinematic kneel, but the desperate, clumsy collapse of a panicked man. His knees hit the marble floor with a dull thud. Rick looked up, his eyes red. I'm begging you. Don't ruin me. I have a son, a mother. Eleanor, who had been standing frozen, jolted back to life at the sight of her son kneeling. But instead of scolding him, what kind of man kneels? She rushed forward, her maternal instinct to protect her own interests taking over. Her voice shifted, becoming so cloyingly sweet, I almost didn't recognize it. Oh, Anna, honey, I'm begging you. Let's talk this out slowly. I'm an old woman, I can't take this. I looked at Eleanor. That honey, if she had said it a few months ago, might have warmed my heart. But said now, it was like being handed a paper towel after someone has just thrown mud in your face. It might wipe away the dirt, but not the humiliation. I placed my hands on the arms of my chair and stood up, not to assert dominance, but to end the spectacle of his kneeling. My voice was even, not sharp, but clear. I don't need anyone to kneel before me. Rick looked up, clinging to my words. So, you'll forgive me? I shook my head slightly. I told you to get up because I don't want this to turn into a melodrama. As for forgiveness, that's a matter for the process to decide. Hearing the word process, Rick flinched as if I'd touched a raw nerve. His voice trembled. Process, always process. Do you even see me as a human being? I didn't counter with logic. I asked him a simple question. When you called me this woman in front of our business partner, did you see me as your wife? Rick opened his mouth, then closed it. His silence was more damning than any argument because some words can't be taken back. You can only live with the consequences. Seeing Rick silenced, Eleanor jumped in, her voice a mix of pleading and scolding. He's a man. They get angry and say things they don't mean. Don't hold it against him. Family problems should be settled behind closed doors. I turned to her and said calmly, "You taught me to settle things behind closed doors, but this morning, you deliberately spoke loudly so a guest could hear who I was." Eleanor's face went rigid, her lips twitching. For the first time, perhaps, she understood that the words she threw out would eventually land back in her own hands. Mr. Thorne remained to one side, maintaining a respectful distance. He did not interfere, but his presence was a mirror. In front of that mirror, Rick couldn't lie, and Eleanor couldn't act. I opened my handbag and took out another thin folder. Not the internal audit report, but a personal one. Something I had prepared long ago but never thought I would have to use so soon. I placed it on the table next to the evidence file, the two folders lying parallel, like two different paths laid out before Rick. This part is about us. Rick's eyes darted to the folder. What is that? I said simply, divorce papers. Eleanor gasped. What? Rick stood frozen, as if he'd been slapped. I didn't raise my voice. I just opened the folder to show him two sets of documents. One for an uncontested divorce, the other for a contested one. Rick lunged forward as if to grab them, but stopped. Perhaps he was afraid that touching the papers was like touching the blade of a knife. He snarled, "Are you threatening me?" I shook my head. "I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you a choice." Eleanor stammered, "Husbands and wives argue. You don't just bring up divorce." I looked at her, then at Rick, my voice as steady as if stating a fact. Arguing is about disagreements. Disrespect, deceit, and turning your wife into a shadow that's not an argument anymore. Rick tried to cling to his last shred of authority. "I won't sign." "What can you do if I don't sign?" I nodded calmly. "If you don't sign the uncontested papers, I will file the contested ones. With sufficient grounds, the court will proceed. Divorce isn't a game where you can trap me by refusing to sign." Rick seemed to run out of air. He stared at me, then suddenly softened his tone, switching to a pleading one. "What do you want? Money? Status? I'll change. I'll respect you, I swear." I let out a small, joyless laugh. I was remembering all the days I stood in the kitchen being taught to know my place. I replied softly, "Your offer of respect now sounds like a last-minute sale at a closing market. The price was high when you had the power, but now that you're afraid, it's suddenly cheap." Rick's face flushed. Eleanor started to retort but stopped herself. The words I used were a direct reflection of their own actions. I pushed the uncontested divorce papers toward Rick, placing them within his reach. "If you sign these, things will end cleanly. You'll keep a shred of dignity, and we won't have a messy public fight." I then placed the contested set beside them, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. "If you drag this out, I will take the other path. And given what you've done at the company, I think you understand you're in no position to bargain." Rick went pale. He looked from the divorce papers to the evidence file. Like a man staring at two cold, steel doors. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps. "Anna, are you trying to ruin us?" I looked at her, my heart no longer boiling. I just felt tired. Tired of people who only know how to care about you when you can protect them. I spoke slowly. "I'm not ruining anyone. I'm just stopping at the right place. You reap what you sow." With that, I withdrew my hands and stood up straight. In the living room, the air conditioner hummed, but no one felt cool. Rick remained standing, his eyes glued to the two sets of papers as if hypnotized. Mr. Thorne looked at me with an understanding expression. From here on, everything would follow the paper trail, and the truth. There was no more talking your way out of it. Rick stood in stunned silence for a long moment, and then the pleading look vanished as if it had never been there. Greed sometimes outruns fear. He looked at the two sets of divorce papers, a glint in his eye, his voice hardening. A divorce means we split the assets. This house, the cars, the savings accounts, the stock options. Don't think you can just take whatever you want. Hearing the word split, the assets was like a shot of oxygen for Eleanor. She immediately stepped forward, forgetting her recent tears. That's right. A marriage means shared property. He's my son, he has his share. He's the one who made this family wealthy. I didn't scowl or retort with, "How dare you?" I just looked at them, then at the broken teapot lid on the floor. I thought to myself, the biggest thing broken in this house isn't the porcelain, it's the trust. I placed my hand on the folder and turned it to face Rick, my voice as even as if I were reading a contract clause. Rick, let's be clear. In a divorce, assets are divided according to the law. That's correct. But what constitutes a marital asset and what is separate property is not for you to decide. Rick snarled, "You're so smart. Prove it." "Fine," I said. I didn't reach for another thick stack of papers. I simply took out the necessary documents I had already prepared within the folder. The first sheet was the incorporation document for the subsidiary that owned the mansion. Company name, tax ID, capital contribution. I placed it on the table, perfectly aligned. This mansion is corporate housing, owned by Apex Properties, a subsidiary that I have 100% ownership of. Established before our marriage. You were permitted to live here as part of your executive compensation package. It is not your personal property, and it is certainly not a marital asset to be divided. Eleanor's jaw dropped. Corporate housing? What are you talking about? This is my son's house. All the neighbors know it. I looked at her, my voice still soft but clear. What the neighbors know is gossip. What the paperwork knows is the law. Rick stepped forward and snatched the paper, his hand trembling. He had probably never imagined that his family's grand home was defined by the cold language of corporate law. He threw the paper back on the table, forcing a sneer. What about the car, the one I drive every day? It's registered in my name. I produced another document. I didn't argue about the registration. I simply presented the company's vehicle provision policy, which listed the car's VIN, the terms of use, and the repossession clause upon termination of employment. I set it down. The car you are using was provided by the company as part of your position as director of sales. The repossession order was issued this morning. The garage access code has been changed. Your right to use the vehicle ended when your employment was suspended. Rick's jaw clenched. Eleanor pointed a finger at me, her voice rising to a screech. You deceived my entire family. I didn't flinch at her accusation. I just found it familiar as the insults that had been hurled at my self-respect for months. I replied, so calmly it only enraged her more, I didn't deceive anyone. I just didn't say anything because I wanted to see how you and Rick would treat me if I didn't have a title. Eleanor's face turned beet red. She started to curse again, but with Mr. Thorne still present, she swallowed her words and switched to a wail. What about the savings? The money in the house belongs to both of us. I looked at Rick. Which account are you referring to? He jutted out his chin. All of it. The project money, everything. You're my wife. You have to share. I tilted my head slightly, my voice still level. The money in the house, if it is marital property accumulated during our marriage, will be settled according to the law. However, any accounts linked to the irregular cash flows have been frozen pending investigation. That's not something I can control, it's a mandatory procedure when there are signs of financial misconduct. Rick went pale, his eyes blinking rapidly. You called the police? I shook my head. I reported it to internal audit and the legal department. Whether they forward the case to the authorities is the next step, depending on their findings. The word findings made Rick gasp for air. He looked to Mr. Thorne as if for support, but Mr. Thorne was not there to save him. He just said, in a very businesslike tone, I'm not interested in your family matters, but if there are signs of misconduct that affect our partnership, I am obligated to protect my company. That statement was like the final nail in the coffin of Rick's hopes of spinning the narrative. He turned to me, his voice low but venomous. "You're a monster. You want me to end up with nothing." I looked him straight in the eye. "Whether you have nothing is determined by what you did with your own 2 hands." Eleanor shot up. "What kind of woman is so cruel? Blood is thicker than water. How could you send your own husband to jail?" I sighed softly. I didn't want this to become a proverb contest, but I answered with something my mother once told me. "Ma'am, you should love others as you love yourself, but love does not mean covering up a crime." I gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and then continued, my voice clear and unwavering. "This afternoon, representatives from asset management and the legal department will be here to execute the repossession of the corporate property. I am giving you 48 hours to pack your personal belongings. A neighborhood representative and local police will be present to ensure everything is transparent and to avoid any commotion." Hearing local police, Eleanor's face turned white as a sheet. She immediately switched to a pleading tone. "Anna, please, this is a family matter. Why involve the police? It will be so embarrassing." I shook my head. Having witnesses prevents anyone from accusing anyone else of anything. I don't want the neighbors hearing a different story tomorrow, one that someone invented. Rick laughed dryly. "You're afraid I'll invent a story?" I looked at him and repeated the exact words he had said to me that morning. "A woman in the living room ruins important business. Remember?" Rick was speechless. Eleanor turned away, her lips pressed tightly together. I didn't need to bring up the word help again. Not because I had forgotten, but because I knew that when people lose their house, their car, and their power, they remember those words on their own every time they look in a mirror. "Mr. Thorne checked his watch. "Miss Harrison, I will see you at your headquarters at 11:30. I want everything to be crystal clear on paper." I nodded. "Yes. Thank you." Mr. Thorne left, leaving behind a heavy silence in the living room. Rick watched the door close, then turned to me, his voice a low growl. "You're good. You won. But you'll regret this." I didn't respond with a challenge. I just said one thing to end all bargaining. "The only thing I regret is ever thinking that respect was something you could ask for." Outside, the sun was still oppressive, but inside this house, the heat was nothing compared to the cold of the truth. It was a cold that left no one with a place to hide. That afternoon, the New York sun still beat down on the roof, but inside the mansion, the air was cold and dry. It was the kind of cold that comes with legal documents being laid on a table. I hadn't stayed to listen to Rick's tirades. I went to the headquarters, finalized the contract with Mr. Thorne, and then returned just before the asset recovery team arrived. Not because I was sentimental about the house, but because I wanted everything to proceed smoothly, to prevent anyone from inventing a story about me sending thugs to evict them. I had called David from the legal department. "Be here at 3 p.m. Bring the official repossession order, handover forms, and the corporate asset inventory." David's reply was concise. "Understood." The word understood, coming from a lawyer, left no room for emotion. At 2:50 p.m., a car pulled up to the gate. I stood in the living room, dressed not in a power suit, but in a simple blouse and dark pants. I wanted this family to see me as a professional, not as someone seeking revenge. The doorbell rang. I opened it. First was David, in a light blue shirt, holding a leather briefcase. Behind him was his assistant, clutching a clipboard. With them were a man from asset management, the head of the local homeowners association, and an officer from the local police department. The HOA president was a man in his 50s, polite and experienced in neighborhood matters. The police officer was younger, his expression serious but not aggressive. The HOA president greeted me. "Miss Harrison, we're here today to witness the execution of this document, as requested by your company, to ensure transparency and prevent misunderstandings." I nodded. "Thank you for coming. I just want everything to be done by the book, so no one is put in an awkward position." Just then, Eleanor came down the stairs. She had changed her clothes and combed her hair, but her eyes were red and swollen. The moment she saw the police officer, she froze, as if doused with cold water. It was the fear not of a uniform, but of the world knowing she was losing her home. Eleanor tried to sound authoritative. "What are you all doing in my house?" David opened his briefcase and produced the order, speaking clearly. "Ma'am, we represent the legal and asset management departments of Apex Properties. We are here today to execute the repossession of this corporate residence, as per company policy, due to a change in the conditions of use." The phrase corporate residence was like a hammer blow to Eleanor. She spun to face me. "You're really going this far?" I didn't answer with a rebuke. I just said what needed to be said. "Please listen to the official reading of the document." Rick burst out of his office, as if he had been waiting for his cue to create a scene. The moment he saw the group, he raised his voice, trying to frame the situation as a home invasion. "Who let you into my house? Are you trying to cause trouble?" The police officer took a half step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, please remain calm. We are only here to witness a civil matter, as requested. This is not an eviction. If you have any objections, you may state them for the official record." The words official record were enough to shut down any screaming match. Rick faltered, then resorted to his old line. "Record of what? This is my house, my wife's and mine. I do not consent." The asset manager opened his inventory list and pointed to a line item, address, asset code, owning entity. He spoke just loudly enough to be heard. "Sir, you have been occupying this property under the terms of your employment. With the suspension of your position, your right of use has been terminated. The repossession is in accordance with internal policy and the legal owner." Rick's eyes blazed. "Anna, you are cruel. You dragged the police and the whole neighborhood here to shame me?" I looked him in the eye. "I brought them here so no one could shame anyone. If you have something to say it for the record." Seeing that yelling was ineffective, Eleanor immediately switched to tears, a classic tactic. "Officers, please, I'm an old woman, we have a young child here. Please give us more time, at least a week." The HOA president sighed. "Ma'am, this is a matter between a corporation and the resident. I am only here as a witness. If you have extenuating circumstances, you should address them to the company representative." I gave the president a slight nod, then said to David, "They will have the full 48 hours as stated in the notice. But personal belongings, identification, and our son's things should be prioritized to prevent any loss." David immediately noted it in the record. Seeing me make a small concession, Rick thought he saw an opening. He immediately softened his tone. "Then let me get my files from the office first. They're important documents." I looked at him, knowing exactly what he wanted. I didn't accuse him of trying to steal anything. I just said, "You may take your personal papers. Any company documents will be inventoried by Mr. David's team. Do not remove them yourself." Rick's eyes widened. "Are you investigating me?" "I am following procedure," I replied curtly. Rick suddenly made a dash for his office, a primal instinct of a man about to lose something vital. David signaled for the asset manager to accompany him. A few minutes later, they returned. In their hands was a stack of papers and a USB drive. David stated clearly, Mr. Harrison was in possession of documents belonging to the company's system. We have noted and recovered them as per the record. In that moment, Rick stood frozen. The entire edifice of defiance he had built since morning collapsed. Eleanor couldn't even cry anymore, she just stared at her son as if he had been stripped naked in a public square. I didn't say a single cruel word. I just signed the document as the representative of the owner, then passed it to Rick. "Read it carefully. If you disagree with any point, you can write your objection." Rick took the pen, his hand shaking. He wanted to refuse to sign as a show of defiance, but in front of the HOA president and the police, not signing wouldn't change the fact that the record was being made. Finally, he slammed the pen down. "I'm not signing." David calmly wrote, "Resident refuses to sign after having read and heard the public notice." The HOA president signed as a witness. The police officer signed and stamped it. Everything was done neatly, like closing a door. As the group prepared to leave, Eleanor tried to follow me, her voice trembling. "Anna, are you really going to throw your mother-in-law out on the street?" I didn't turn back. I just said one thing, enough for her to understand the price of her behavior. "You once taught me to know my place. Today, I'm just helping you remember that everyone has to mind their own." I walked them to the door and locked it. Inside, only Rick, Eleanor, and I remained, along with the silence. There was no more boasting, no applause, just the hum of the air conditioner and the ragged breathing of people who had just realized that some things are lost not because someone is cruel, but because you have taken them for granted for too long. The moment the door clicked shut, Rick slammed his hand on the table. The sound echoed in the empty room, as hollow as rotting wood. He was no longer shouting at the officials, they were gone. So he turned all his fury on me. "You're unbelievable, Anna," he seethed, his lips trembling. "You bring the police and the whole neighborhood here. What's next? Are you going to tell the world I'm a thief who stole a house?" I looked at Rick, my voice calm. "The world doesn't need me to tell them anything. The official record has been signed." He let out a derisive laugh, a sound like crumpled paper. "The record? That was all you're doing. You're the CEO. You can get anyone to sign whatever you want." I didn't answer that. Arguing about such things would only reduce me to begging for the truth. I just stated a fact. You had the right to record your objections. You refused to sign. That, too, is part of the record. Eleanor collapsed onto the sofa, clutching her chest as if her heart was being squeezed. A moment later, she shot up, driven by a lifetime of worrying about appearances. She marched to the front door, threw it open, and shrieked, "Everyone, come and see. My daughter-in-law is throwing her own family out on the street." I stood still. I didn't rush to close the door. I knew that the moment I stepped outside, the narrative would become abusive daughter-in-law, just as she wanted. The world's tongue has no bones, but I had no intention of offering my face to be cut by it. Seeing his mother had drawn an audience, Rick immediately joined in. He pulled out his phone and started making calls, his voice artfully pained. "Hello, Mike? You gotta help me, man. Anna, she's been hiding who she is for years, and now she's taking everything. Can you come over and say a word for me?" I recognized the name one of Rick's drinking buddies who liked to act like a big shot. Rick made one call after another, sending out a barrage of texts. "I'm being set up. I'm in trouble. Dude, I need you." He was trying to assemble a crowd to pressure me, thinking that a mob would make me afraid. But life isn't a fish market. People only join a mob when they're sure they'll benefit or won't get hurt. The moment they smell the words legal department and internal audit, most of them back away. Just as I expected, the person on the other end of the first call paused, then mumbled, "Let me see, man. I'm kinda busy." The second call was shorter. "That's your family's problem, you handle it." The third one disconnected mid-sentence. Rick's face flushed with rage. He couldn't accept that he was being abandoned. He turned to me and threw out an accusation like a stone. "See? Because of you, I've lost all my friends." I asked gently, "Or is it because they're afraid of being implicated?" Rick was speechless. He turned away, then suddenly pulled his mother. "Mom, let's go outside. You have to tell the whole neighborhood how vicious she is." Eleanor was ready. She pulled out a tissue, dabbed at her dry eyes, and went to the gate, telling anyone who would listen the same story. Her daughter-in-law had hidden her identity, deceived her husband, and was now stealing all his assets to throw his mother out. The story sounded tragic, but it had holes. A practical neighbor asked, "So, whose name is the house in?" Eleanor stammered. "Well, it's theirs, the husband and wife's." Another neighbor added quietly, "I saw the legal team and the HOA president signing official papers this afternoon. It didn't look like anyone was stealing anything." Eleanor's face fell. She changed her tactic, appealing to emotion. "She controls all the paperwork. I'm an old woman. She has no pity. I stood inside, listening vaguely. I felt neither happy nor sad. I just saw clearly that Eleanor didn't need the truth, she needed an audience. But the audience in this upscale suburb was different now. They might enjoy a bit of drama, but then they'd ask to see the paperwork. Rick threw his phone on the table, his voice full of venom. You think you're above the law? What you're doing violates your duties as a wife. I looked at him and answered, my voice not harsh but sharp enough to cut through his cheap moralizing. My duties as a wife do not include abetting a crime. He laughed contemptuously. You talk a good game, but are you sure the company will back you? That CEO title is just temporary. I'll talk to the board of directors. I'll tell them you abused your power. I nodded, as if granting him the right to hope. Go ahead. Then I picked up my phone and texted my assistant, Sarah, a single line. Distribute the internal announcement as per the approved template. Send to the relevant partners on the list. Sarah replied immediately. Yes, ma'am. Less than 10 minutes later, Rick's phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an email from the office of the board of directors and the internal company announcement. Suspension of duties. Demand for handover of company property. System access revoked. A summons to a meeting with internal audit and legal. The document wasn't long, but every word was like a nail being hammered in. After reading it, Rick's face went ashen. He tried to log into the company system on his phone. The screen returned a single, cold line, access denied. Rick threw his phone onto the sofa as if trying to throw away the truth itself. He yelled. What have you done? You've cut off my lifeline. I didn't cut off your lifeline, I said. I'm just pointing out that you should have held on to it when you had the chance. Eleanor ran in from outside, her expression a mix of anger and panic. They don't believe me. They said there were official documents, a legal team. She turned to me. Anna, why are you so cruel? I looked at her calmly. Because this time, it's not just a story you can tell. Eleanor froze, then her voice softened as she tried a new tactic. Then, can you give me a few more days? So I can find a place. I'm an old woman. I didn't throw her out on the spot. I just reminded her of the timeline that was now in writing, 48 hours. As per the official record, seeing that he couldn't move me, Rick tried to find another chink in my armor. You think you're so clean? You hid your identity, played the part of the dutiful daughter-in-law. You're a hypocrite, too. I looked him straight in the eye and spoke slowly. I was silent to protect the company and to see people for who they truly are. Hypocrisy is doing something wrong and then demanding others stay silent to cover for you. Rick was speechless. He shot up from his seat and began pacing like a caged animal. Eleanor slumped down, gasping for breath, all the fight gone out of her. The large house suddenly felt very small, because everyone was cornered by their own actions. I picked up my bag and checked my work calendar on my phone. The conference room was ready. The legal team was reviewing the contract clauses. My assistant had arranged the schedule. I glanced at the clock and said concisely, without a trace of threat or sarcasm, I'm going to the office. You two pack your personal belongings as per the inventory. Don't touch any corporate assets. I don't want to add another line to the official record. With that, I walked to the door. Behind me, Rick stood, his mouth open as if to curse, but then closing it, perhaps fearing he would be cursing his own future. Eleanor watched me go, her eyes empty. Outside the gate, the neighborhood chatter had died down. The story no longer smelled of theft, it smelled of a lawful repossession. I closed the door, not locking it, just pulling it gently until it clicked. Inside me, something clicked too, closing a chapter I had endured for far too long. At 11:25 a.m., I walked through the lobby of the Apex Logistics headquarters. The lobby was vast, with polished marble floors and the company logo prominently displayed on the main wall, a reminder that here, everything was measured by process, not by words. I went straight to the elevator, not stopping for small talk. Today, every minute counted. The executive conference room was ready. My assistant, Sarah, sat at the long table, a folder of contract clauses in front of her. David from legal was there, his laptop open to the final revised terms. Vincent from internal audit sat quietly, but his presence was an anchor, a guarantee that this process was clean. I took my seat at the head of the table and quickly reviewed my checklist. It was a habit. Before signing anything, I reread the points that could be misinterpreted. In business, you don't fear difficulty, you fear ambiguity. At 11:28 a.m., Mr. Thorne arrived. He was accompanied by a young assistant carrying a briefcase. As he entered, he surveyed the room, the people, the setup. His expression was softer than it had been at my house that morning. Perhaps because here, everything was in its proper place. No one had to act. I stood to shake his hand. This time, the handshake wasn't a surprise. It was the handshake of two partners who had agreed on the principle of transparency. "Thank you for being on time," I said. Mr. Thorne nodded. "I like being on time. And I like following procedure." I looked at David. He began, his voice clear and concise. Apex Logistics would like to represent two key items. 1. A clause on risk control and the right to suspend the contract if any data irregularities arise. 2. A commitment to transparent cash flow and volume verification according to the agreed-upon standards. Mr. Thorne listened intently, not just for show. He reviewed the documents, making notes with a pen, occasionally asking a pointed question. Who has the final sign-off on this verification point? Is the spoilage data reported daily or weekly? If a discrepancy arises, what is the response time? Each question was a checkpoint, and each of our answers was backed by a document. I didn't try to be charming, I was just direct. At one point, Mr. Thorne looked at me and asked, "Miss Harrison, I want to hear it from you. Why did you dare to stop the deal right before the signing?" Many companies would have just pushed it through and dealt with the fallout later. I didn't evade the question. My answer was short and honest. Because if I had signed it knowing there was a risk, I would have been passing a time bomb to you. I'm in logistics. I know that one bad link can break the entire chain. I need this chain to be clean from the start. Mr. Thorne nodded very slowly, like a man setting down a heavy burden of doubt. That gives me confidence. Sarah brought out the summary agreement. David reviewed it one last time. I signed first, my signature neat and efficient. Mr. Thorne signed after. The sound of the pen on paper was soft, but to me, it was the sound of a door closing on a major risk. 11:30 a.m. On the dot. After the signing, there was no applause, no celebratory champagne. I just nodded and said simply, "Thank you. My team will update you on the implementation schedule and points of contact." Mr. Thorne replied, "Just keep doing what you did today. I like working with people who take responsibility." The phrase "take responsibility" made me think of Rick. He often talked about responsibility, but only when he was sitting in a position of power. When responsibility stared him in the face, all he wanted to do was pull someone else down with him. Mr. Thorne stood to leave, then added one more thing, not as a compliment, but as an observation from a seasoned businessman. "Miss Harrison, I've met many CEOs who talk a good game. But I have rarely met one who is willing to cut out the rot in their own house, to save the entire business." I didn't reply with a flowery phrase. I just smiled faintly. An old proverb came to mind, "Bitter medicine cures the disease." Some pains must be endured to save what is still alive. After Mr. Thorne left, the conference room felt quiet again. Vincent looked at me and said softly, "The repossession team has completed the documentation." The resident refused to sign, but it was fully witnessed. "Good," I nodded. Sarah handed me my phone, open to a new message. Rick's meeting schedule with internal audit and legal had been confirmed and sent. I glanced at it and said, "Log the delivery confirmation." David closed his laptop. "Do you need to add a request for evidence preservation?" "Yes," I replied. "But keep it concise. I don't want to create an atmosphere of a witch hunt. Just stay within the scope." I don't want Apex to become a place where people are afraid. I want it to be a place where people know that if you do wrong, you will be held accountable, and if you do right, you will be protected. That's what governance is. It's not about who likes whom, it's about the rules being fair for everyone. I left the conference room and walked down the long hallway. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls, making the floor gleam. I remembered that morning at the house, when I was standing behind the kitchen partition, listening to Eleanor call me the help. The same sun, the same heat, but what a difference in spirit. At home, I was a shadow. Here, I was the one responsible, and I understood that what earns you respect isn't a suit or a title, but the ability to put things back in their proper order. I stepped into the elevator. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, probably a neighbor. Anna, there were a lot of people at your house this afternoon, even the police. Is everything okay? I didn't reply. I didn't need to explain myself to the world. I just needed to have the evidence and the documents. The elevator descended, its doors opening to the lobby. I adjusted my bag and stepped out. The New York heat still radiated from the pavement. The traffic was a chaotic blur. I didn't look back at the Apex logo. I knew I still had to handle the final part at home, where Rick and his mother were still thrashing about. But it was just thrashing. When the documents have been signed, the access has been revoked, and the door has been locked with signatures and official stamps, there's not much left to do. I got back to the house as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow on the steps. But the heat wasn't as irritating as the sound of gossip from the gate. This was a quiet suburb, any disturbance drew attention. But being watched wasn't the scary part. The scary part was someone trying to turn that attention into a weapon. Rick was standing in the yard, his shirt wrinkled, holding his phone up as if live streaming, shouting towards the gate. "Everyone, look! My wife is abusing her power, using her people to throw her husband out on the street." A few neighbors stood at a distance, not getting too close, just huddled together like they were watching a movie. I walked through the gate, unhurried. I didn't snatch Rick's phone or demand to know what he was doing. I understood that when someone is determined to perform, any interference just becomes evidence for their play. The HOA president and the police officer were already there, standing with David and the asset manager. Seeing me, the president nodded. "Miss Harrison, we're just here to witness the final inventory, to prevent any trouble." "Thank you," I replied. David opened his briefcase and spoke loudly enough for the onlookers to hear. "Today, we are finalizing the inventory of corporate assets and sealing items belonging to the company. Mr. Harrison and his mother have 48 hours to remove their personal belongings." Rick laughed dryly, panning his phone toward David's face. "You hear that? Sealing! She wants to take everything." The police officer stepped forward, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Sir, lower your voice. You have the right to state your objections for the record. As for filming, you may do so from outside the designated work area, without causing an obstruction." The words "without causing an obstruction" stopped Rick in his tracks. His lips trembled, but he didn't dare cross the line. He was afraid of getting another infraction on his record. Eleanor ran out of the house, clutching a cloth bag. The moment she saw me, she burst into tears. "Anna, if you do this, the whole world will laugh at me. I'll die of shame." I looked at her, not engaging in a debate about shame. I just asked a practical question. "Have you started packing your personal things?" Eleanor froze. She was used to using tears to get her way, but tears couldn't change the timeline on an official document. She looked to Rick for help. He immediately seized the opportunity, shouting louder. "She's pressuring my mother, do you see this? She's harassing an old woman." I didn't respond to Rick. I signaled to the asset manager to begin reading the inventory. He read each item concisely. Company security system. Access cards. Keys to the utility room. Handover files. There was no dramatic ransacking, just a calm, procedural verification. Seeing there was no drama for his camera, Rick tried to create some. He ran toward the staircase, aiming for his office. I didn't chase him. I just turned to David and said, "Please have someone accompany him to document any company materials." There was no struggle. David signaled for two people to follow Rick. Less than 2 minutes later, they returned. Rick was clutching a stack of papers and a folder. He held them tight like a life raft. David said clearly, "Mr. Harrison is in possession of documents on the company asset list. We request that he hand them over to be sealed." Rick yelled, "These are my papers. I made them, I'm keeping them." I looked at him, my voice still even. "Your personal papers are yours to keep. Company documents, you have no right to remove. You just said you wanted transparency." Let's start here. The word transparency choked him. He looked around and saw the neighbors still watching. He tried to rally them to his side, turning to the gate. "Everyone be my witness. She's robbing me." A man standing nearby shook his head and said quietly, but loud enough to be heard, "The police and the HOA are right there. How is that robbing?" Another woman added, "They're reading from a list and making a record." It looks very official. The crowd was no longer on Rick's side. People might enjoy gossip, but no one wants to side with the person who is clearly in the wrong when there are official stamps right in front of them. David presented the form to Rick. "If you have any objections, write them here. Otherwise, sign the handover for the documents." Rick clenched his jaw. He looked at me, then suddenly his tone shifted, changing tactics in an instant. "Anna, just let me keep these for a few days. I have to work with the other party." I shook my head. Just one word, no. No raised voice, no long explanation. Rick froze. He understood that in that single no, an entire door had been locked. Seeing Rick defeated, Eleanor rushed to pull my arm, her voice trembling. "Anna, please. I have nowhere else to go." I pulled my arm away, not forcefully, but decisively. I spoke slowly. "Pack your personal belongings. You can stay with relatives or rent a temporary place. But don't try to sway me with tears anymore. Your tears don't erase the words you said this morning." Eleanor stood frozen, her face white. Rick looked at his mother, then at me, his eyes red with a powerless rage. David documented the handover of the materials, sealing them according to procedure. The HOA president signed as a witness. The police officer signed and stamped. The sound of the pen on paper was steady, like the sound of a lock clicking into place. When everything was done, the police officer reminded the family to pack within the given time and to direct any disputes through the legal department, not to cause a public disturbance. Rick wanted to yell more, but the words were stuck in his throat. He just breathed heavily, his shoulders shaking. I looked at him, not with satisfaction, but with a clear thought. You can put on a show for the neighbors, but you can't put on a show for an official stamp. The officials left. The neighbors dispersed, the show being over. The yard suddenly felt much larger, but it was a cold, empty space. Rick stood in the middle of it, for the first time, with no one to lean on. Eleanor silently went back into the house, her feet like lead. I walked past them, went inside, and quickly checked on my son's things and my personal documents, placing them in a separate bag. I didn't want to hear accusations of missing items tomorrow. I was tired of the whirlpools they created. I stood by the window looking out at the back garden. The hot wind rustled the leaves. I remembered something my mother used to tell me: in life, winning or losing isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about whether you're standing on solid ground. And I knew, from this moment on, they could hate me, but they could no longer drag me down with their lies. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had anything left to do in that house, but because I wanted to tie up the last loose end. Rick and Eleanor had been up most of the night. I heard doors opening and closing, the scrape of furniture, and Eleanor's heavy sighs. But I didn't go out. There are some tragedies that, if you watch them, make it seem like your victory comes from witnessing another's misery. I didn't need that kind of victory. I brewed a simple pot of tea and sat alone at the dining table, looking around the living room that had once been their stage. The chandelier was still bright, the sofa still gleaming, but the air of authority Eleanor used to project was gone. True quality speaks for itself. A performance is only fragrant for a few hours before it fades. Around 8 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, my assistant. It was brief. Rick's meeting with internal audit and legal is confirmed. Notification sent requiring his timely attendance with personal identification. I read it and replied with 2 words, acknowledged. When it came to the company, I couldn't afford to be soft. Softness in this context wasn't kindness. It was leaving the door open for malpractice to return. At about 9 a.m., Rick came downstairs. He wasn't wearing a crisp shirt or carrying himself like an executive anymore. His eyes were shadowed, his lips dry, his shoulders slumped like a man who had lost something immense. He looked at me for a long moment, then said in a hoarse voice, "You're happy now, aren't you?" I didn't look at him with an expression of triumph. I looked at him like a person who had chosen the wrong path. "I'm just disappointed," I replied. "Disappointed because you had the chance to be a decent man." He let out a twisted laugh. "Decent? In this business, who gets ahead by being decent?" I sipped my tea. "If you rise by dirty means, you fall by dirty means. The only difference is that the fall hurts more." Rick was silent. This time, his silence wasn't arrogant. It was helpless. He looked around the house as if trying to hold on to something familiar, but a house is just walls. When your right to be there is gone, the walls don't take sides. Eleanor came out of her room, carrying a small bag. She wasn't crying anymore. The performative tears of yesterday were gone. Now, all that was left was the exhaustion of someone who had just been woken up by a hard slap from reality. She looked at me, her voice small, no longer sharp. "Anna, were you really the CEO all along?" I nodded. "Yes." Eleanor swallowed hard, asking another question as if still trying to find someone else to blame. "Why didn't you say so sooner?" "If I had known, I would have." She trailed off. "I knew what she meant. I would have treated you differently." But that itself was the most shameful part. I looked her straight in the eye. "Eleanor, if respect only comes after you know my title, then it isn't respect. It's a calculation." Her lips trembled, her eyes reddening. She turned away and looked out at the yard, her voice choked. I was so stupid. I didn't add insult to injury. "It wasn't stupidity," I said. "It was just a habit of looking down on others." Eleanor clutched her bag and walked slowly to the door. On the top step, she paused, as if wanting to say something else, but then thought better of it. Perhaps for the first time, she understood the saying, in life, always leave yourself a way back. But she had said too much and done too much. Her way back was no longer the same. Rick pulled his suitcase behind him, the wheels rattling on the marble floor. He turned to look at me one last time, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "You won. But don't think life will always be on your side." I stood still and replied with a simple truth. I don't expect life to be on my side. I just stand on the side of the truth. Rick said no more. He and his mother walked out the gate. A few neighbors watched them go, but no one ran over to join in. Yesterday, they had seen the documents, the signatures, the official stamps. Drama might buy a few minutes of curiosity, but it can't buy long-term belief. I closed the gate and went back inside. The house was strangely quiet. I did one final walkthrough. My son's things were packed, my papers were in order, the keys were left as per the handover inventory. I didn't want to leave a single loose thread for someone to weave a new life from. Better safe than sorry. Before leaving, I stood in the kitchen for a moment, the very place they had tried to confine me. I looked at the empty hook where my apron used to hang, and I almost laughed. An apron. If they wanted, they could use it to diminish you. But if you were clear-headed enough, you could hang it up and walk right out the front door, a whole person. I picked up my bag and walked out without looking back. Not because I was cold, but because that chapter was closed. The lesson I learned from all this is simple: in a marriage, patience is only worth it if the other person is reasonable. But if your patience turns you into a shadow, then standing up for yourself at the right time is the only way to save yourself. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like to support Broken Promises. And if you have any thoughts, please share them in the comments below. I always appreciate hearing from you. Thank you, dear listeners, for staying with us until the very end. I wish you all health, peace, and warmth. Goodbye for now, and I hope you'll join us for our next story on Twilight Reflections.